In a world where voices rise louder than reason and anger drowns out understanding, there are those who choose a different path. They don't march, they don't chant, they don't scream, they simply choose to act in silence. This is the story of a quiet rebellion, not fueled by rage, but by resilience, not broadcasted on stages, but whispered through choices at counters, stores, and supply chains. While one man raged from behind a podium, an entire nation responded without ever raising its voice. And in that silence was strength in the shadows of global headlines. And away from the noise of political rallies, a quiet movement began to stir. There were no massive protests, no fiery speeches, no trending hashtags leading the charge. But across cities, towns, and rural corners of Canada, ordinary people made a decision, a subtle shift in behavior, almost imperceptible at first, yet powerful enough to rattle the economic momentum of a movement fueled by noise. This wasn't about waving flags. This wasn't about storming streets. It was about choice. Intentional, quiet, persistent, reciproven, Fallon, and the Wizard. While U.S. markets push forward with a MAGA first agenda, aiming to reignite a brand of aggressive nationalism and economic dominance, Canadian citizens responded not with confrontation, but calculation. They looked at where their goods came from. They paused before purchasing American-made products. They started supporting local, turning to European and Asian imports, reinvesting in domestic production, and without ever holding a sign, they made a statement stronger than slogans. It began in supermarkets and shopping malls, in the digital aisles of e-commerce, in the simple but profound decision to shift dollars away from their southern neighbor. Canadian businesses, long dependent on U.S. suppliers, began diversifying their partnerships. Trade networks, once tightly bound to American manufacturers, slowly unraveled and reknit themselves. It was resilience disguised as routine. For years, the MAGA movement had drawn strength from the assumption that America's economic weight guaranteed loyalty, that allies would follow, that neighbors would comply. But loyalty built on imbalance doesn't last. And when rhetoric turned hostile, when diplomacy gave way to insults and tariffs, something changed north of the border. Canada did not respond with equal volume, but with quiet, strategic distancing. It wasn't an announcement, it was an evolution. In the boardrooms of Canadian enterprises, conversation shifted. Dependence was now a liability. Every invoice from an American vendor sparked a question. Can we replace this? Can we build this at home? Can we source this elsewhere? And when enough people ask the same questions, when enough companies decide to test the waters beyond the familiar, entire economies begin to pivot. Trump's rhetoric, loud and confrontational, was meant to intimidate, to assert dominance, but the louder the shout, the deeper the silence grew in Canada. And in that silence was something more formidable than noise. It was resolve, a shared understanding that lasting strength is built through patience, not provocation. That true independence is not shouted from podiums, but engineered through small, consistent action. Supply chains, once taken for granted, began to shift. Canadian farmers turned to domestic processors. Retailers restructured sourcing strategies. Technology firms explored new partnerships in Europe and Asia. From oil to oats, software to steel, the quiet rejection spread, not with protest signs, but purchase orders. Not through outrage, but optimization. This wasn't just about economics. It was cultural, philosophical. Canadians, known for their politeness and pragmatism, chose not to match fire with fire, but to starve the flame altogether. They understood that resistance doesn't have to be loud to be effective, that true power sometimes lies in what you choose not to support, not with anger, but with intentional absence. Behind the curtain of economic data, trade imbalances began to appear. U.S. exports to Canada slowed in key sectors. Certain American brands saw a dip in their northern markets. The MAGA machine, driven by nostalgia and bluster, failed to consider the quiet dignity of those it underestimated. It failed to account for the ripple effect of steady, purposeful disengagement, because while the movement focused on rallies and red hats, its neighbors watched, listened, and eventually turned away. Not out of spite, but out of principle. Not with fireworks, but with finesse. Canada's resistance wasn't about punishment. It was about realignment. It was about asking, what future do we want to build? And who do we want to build it with? And when that future became incompatible with the values coming out of Washington, Canadians didn't argue. They recalibrated. They quietly walked away. In that walk, in that absence of noise, was a message louder than any political chant. You cannot bully loyalty. You cannot force respect. And when the time comes, even the most polite neighbor knows when to close the door. It didn't begin with a grand declaration. There were no dramatic calls to action, no government mandates, no viral campaigns. It began with a mother in Vancouver choosing not to buy strawberries grown in California, a mechanic in Nova Scotia deciding to replace his parts supplier with a local one, a young entrepreneur in Toronto swapping out American software for a European alternative. One by one, across the country, choices began to shift, quietly, intentionally. And as those decisions multiplied, so did their impact. Everyday Canadians, not activists, not politicians, just people, began to respond in the most Canadian way possible, not with conflict, but with conscience, not with protest signs, but with receipts. They started asking questions. Where's this product made? Whose policies am I funding when I buy this brand? What do my purchases say about the kind of country I want to support? For decades, Canada had been America's loyal trading partner, sharing not only borders, but shelves, supply chains, and spending habits. But something changed, not overnight, but gradually. As rhetoric from the South grew louder and more divisive, Canadians began to feel a quiet dissonance, a growing discomfort. The slogans, the tariffs, the thinly veiled contempt, they didn't go unnoticed. They sat in the back of the mind. They echoed in the aisles of stores and at the checkout counter. And so began a subtle rebellion, not fueled by fury, but by values. Choosing local not just to support Canadian businesses, but to make a statement that economic loyalty must go both ways, that respect can be demanded while simultaneously undermined, that true friendships between nations isn't built on leverage, but mutual regard. In cities like Calgary and Winnipeg, cafes stopped serving American-branded coffee. In Quebec, boutique stores removed U.S. fashion lines from their racks. In British Columbia, vineyards promoted by Canadian campaigns, not with aggression, but with quiet pride. Teachers, nurses, students, retirees, people from all walks of life began practicing a new form of citizenship, voting with their wallets. It wasn't about hatred or hostility. It was about holding fast to identity, about choosing what felt aligned with dignity and fairness. And the beauty of it was in its simplicity. No one needed to shout. No one needed to rally. All they had to do was choose. These choices rippled outward. Retailers noticed, distributors felt it, American companies saw subtle dips in sales. Trade analysts were puzzled at first. The numbers didn't match the headlines because this wasn't a policy shift, it was a people shift. And people, once awakened, do not forget. In doing what seemed ordinary, grocery shopping, renewing subscriptions, updating supply lists, Canadians were doing something extraordinary. They were reminding the world that protest can wear a polite smile, that resistance doesn't need to disrupt traffic to move economies, that power is not always loud. Sometimes it is measured, patient, and deliberate. In a time when outrage is often the currency of influence, Canadians proved that calm conviction could be just as potent. They didn't wait for permission or media coverage. They simply acted collectively and consistently. And in that consistency was power. The power to remind a neighboring superpower that respect is not assumed, it's earned. That economic influence is not a one-way street, and that even the smallest choices made by millions of quiet citizens can reshape the direction of history. There's a reason Trump's rage is so loud, so theatrical, so persistent. It's not just showmanship. It's not just branding. It's a shield for something deeper, something fragile, because behind the shouting, the tariffs, the finger pointing, is a quiet truth the world is starting to recognize. America's trade dominance isn't what it used to be. And the louder Trump yells about winning, the more obvious it becomes. He's afraid of winning. Trade has always been America's hammer, wielded with the weight of a superpower, demanding deals, reshaping economies, backed by military might and media control. But now, cracks are forming in that hammer. And rather than address the rot, Trump chooses to rage at the ones walking away. Canada's quiet boycott, its subtle economic distancing, was never designed to provoke him, but it did something far more dangerous. It exposed him. It showed that loyalty isn't guaranteed, that even America's closest allies will recalibrate when respect turns into ridicule. And that is what terrifies him. This fear isn't about Canada's actions. It's about what those actions reveal. That American trade politics, built on dominance, not partnership, is brittle under pressure. That decades of assuming leverage have led to complacency. That the MAGA model, loud, combative isolationist, doesn't work in a world where power has become more distributed, where influence is measured not in noise, but in trust. Every tweet, every insult, every threat of economic retaliation isn't strength. It's a scream into the void, a desperate attempt to reassert control in a world that's quietly moving on. The rage is not about losing trade deals, it's about losing narrative, losing the myth that America always gets its way. And Trump, the master of image, can't tolerate the sight of America being silently, steadily resisted by a neighbor that refuses to play his game. He needs enemies to blame. He needs conflict to survive. But when the enemy doesn't fight back, when they just step aside, reorganize, reinvest in themselves, the rage turns inward. Trump's outrage becomes a mirror, reflecting the anxiety of a system that no longer holds all the cards. And every Canadian consumer who chooses local, every business that diversifies supply chains, every quiet act of defiance, tightens that mirror's grip. It shows the world that U.S. trade power isn't eternal, that trust, once broken, isn't so easily repaired, and that maybe, just maybe, America's loudest man is yelling because he's finally been heard in a way it never wanted to be. It started without headline. No camera crews, no chants echoing through the streets, no dramatic footage for the nightly news, just a million small pauses before swiping a card, before clicking add to cart, before buying into the noise. Across Canada, people weren't waiting for permission to protest. They didn't need rallies to remind them of their power. They had wallets. They had values. And in a world of hyper-politicized markets, they knew exactly how to make a statement. Without ever saying a word, Trump's rhetoric had reached a fever pitch. Insults toward allies, tariffs disguised as strategy, and policies rooted more in ego than economics. While the MAGA movement grew louder, Canadian consumers became quieter and sharper, less emotional, more intentional. They began choosing differently, not because someone told them to, but because it felt right. Right to support local farmers, local software, local brands with global ethics. Right to opt for trade partners who respect sovereignty, not manipulate it. Boycotts didn't come with picket signs. They came with changed habits. They came in checkout lines and online orders. They came in the subtle decision to stop supporting businesses that profited from policies of division. This wasn't a political campaign, it was personal. A quiet revolution of integrity, no voting with every dollar, no press conferences, no slogans, just action. And it wasn't just about American goods, it was about the idea that a neighbor doesn't get to bully you and still expect your business. That economic loyalty is earned, not assumed. And when that loyalty is taken for granted, it fades. Retailers noticed, supply chain analysts noticed, American exporters noticed. The numbers whispered what the headlines didn't, that something was shifting, that a consumer base once counted on had grown distant. The beauty of the Canadian response was in its discipline. No chaos, no confrontation, just clarity. In coffee shops that stocked local beans, in bookstores featuring Canadian authors, in grocery stores quietly prioritizing homegrown products. Not as a rejection, but as a redefinition. These weren't acts of anger. They were acts of self-respect, of collective intelligence, of saying, we see what's happening and we don't need to shout. We just need to choose differently. Even big business adapted. Canadian companies began sourcing from new partners, adjusting logistics, investing in independence, not out of vengeance, but out of vision. A vision that no single market should hold sway over a country's conscience. And as the boycotts grew, so did something else, confidence, that in every decision, no matter how small, lies the potential to steer a nation. That's how Canadian consumers took a stand. No fireworks, no podiums, just people choosing with purpose and proving that real change doesn't always need a banner to be seen.